and rock and roll. Let me get over to the slides. So, like I said, we're going to talk some navigational instruments. I'm going to start off the session continuing our airspace discussion because there are a few airspaces that we didn't cover last time that are very important. And we'll wrap the session up with a simulated flight plan. We're going to plan a flight together on the screen, and we will we'll put our navigation or our flight log together, and we'll probably do this each session from here on out as we learn a little bit more progressive information on flight planning. Like, for instance, I think in a couple sessions we're going to talk weather, and so we'll tie that into the flight planning process as well. But before we do that, I want to just finish up our airspace discussion. Last class we talked class A, B, C, D, E, and G. And of course, 4 of those airspaces are or can be associated with an airport. We're going to talk here about some airspaces that are not associated with an airport. However, they do happen to show up on your sectional. And they're not necessarily given letters like A, B, C, D, but instead names. And it's important for you to know these because it can keep you out of some trouble. The first 2 that we'll talk about are prohibited and restricted. Prohibited and restricted airspace is airspace that you want to avoid. Prohibited more so. Prohibited airspace you're actually not allowed to fly through regardless of the circumstances. If you are flying on a VFR flight and you're not in communication with air traffic control, you cannot fly through prohibited. Even if you are in contact with air traffic control, you still cannot fly through it. This particular airspace that I've got up on the screen is actually President George W. Bush's ranch outside of Waco. See if I can find it here. Here it is. So the FAA has given former President Bush an airspace that starts at the surface and goes all the way up through to Class A, Class Alpha, and you cannot transition that airspace, regardless of whether air traffic control tells you can or not. Prohibited airspace is from a permanent airspace perspective the most stringent, so you cannot fly through there. Restricted airspace, which was the other airspace on the slide, is of the same nature. They are set up on typically near military bases or areas where the FAA has determined that there's an interest of national security, and so restricted airspaces like the one over here by Gray Air Force Base is you are technically allowed to transition this airspace, and you do not have to have any prior approval. However, it is strongly suggested that you avoid it. Like I said, for purposes of national security, they do a lot of aerial tactical jet training in these airspaces. They do a lot of unmanned aircraft training, and there's a lot of ballistics and stuff like that. So restricted areas you don't want to go through either, although you are technically allowed to. As opposed to prohibited, you're not allowed to, regardless of the circumstances.
I mean, wouldn't you think it would be reversed? I mean, the president's ranch versus a place where there's going to be ballistics being practiced. I don't know. It just seems odd to me.
Yeah, they give, this isn't, the prohibited airspace isn't President George W. Bush's only protection. He actually also has a mansion in uptown Dallas. And there's actually a temporary flight restriction over that airspace, that red circle. So, yeah, good segue, by the way. So the TFR, the temporary flight restriction, is actually not on your aviation sectional. In fact, I'll just remove it if I can. Doesn't look like it's going to let me. Anyway, if you purchase a paper sectional from the FAA, the red circle will not be there. Temporary flight restrictions, or TFRs, are, as the name suggests, are temporary in nature. They're not there permanently, which is why it's not printed on the chart. Now, many commercially available services like this website I'm on will put them on, will overlay them on the chart. But there really is only one source of data that you should trust. And it's at tfr.faa.gov. This is technically, legally speaking, the only source for TFR information. And temporary flight restrictions are established for the same reason that the prohibited airspace is established, but they're temporary in nature. So several days, several hours. For example, they establish TFR over every NFL stadium on NFL Sunday. They will establish TFR over every airspace that the President of the United States is over. So, for instance, if we go over to Washington, D.C., if President Trump is currently there, so here's the temporary flight restriction over Washington, D.C. And like I said, you can't necessarily trust that website, so you have to actually verify during your flight planning that that it exists. So this is just a huge list of TFRs that are currently in existence. You can see theme parks get TFRs, etc. So if the prohibited airspace is going to be temporary in nature, they'll just establish a TFR. And the consequence for flying through a TFR is similar to the prohibited. It's unlawful. And maybe you guys have heard stories about pilots transitioning TFRs. It's usually it's usually a byproduct of poor flight planning. So you don't want to get involved in that. There's the TFR to the left. There's two more airspaces I want to go through. One is there on the top right. It's called a warning airspace. And the warning airspace is all airspace 3 miles off the coast of the United States. It's called a National Air Defense Zone. And this airspace, similar to the restricted airspace, it's kind of like you can fly through it, but you shouldn't unless you're on a flight plan or somebody clears you or you have prior approval. So you won't necessarily go to jail if you fly through it, but it is definitely not recommended.
Why is that law in place?
For the warning, so the warning airspaces are there for national security. If you look at the map, it surrounds all of, let's see, where am I at? It surrounds the United States all the way around the coast. So you've got warning areas here, warning. And so, if you would imagine if we were in a significant situation of national defense, the U.S. military would want the authority to control that airspace. You can see it goes all the way around the country.
Got it.
Now, like I said, you can fly through it, and typically pilots that do fly through a warning area will file a flight plan so that it's on record that they're flying through it, and they get air traffic control clearance to fly through it. And what the controlling agencies will do is they'll submit your flight plan to the controlling agency that controls these warning areas. And certainly if there was an issue, like if you were flying your airplane and you were about to leave the country and there was a just for example a terrorist attack and the country went on lockdown, then air traffic control will get word that they've shut down the airspace, and you'd have to figure something out, land your airplane.
So this might be a dumb question, but the kind of aircraft that we're going to be flying, can we really leave the country?
Yeah, you could. Since you guys are down in Houston, you could fly to Mexico.
Okay.
And the only thing keeping you from doing that would be a commercial pilot's license. You do have to have your commercial pilot's license to transition the country's borders. But yeah, it's you might need a fuel stop in a Cessna 172. But yeah, as far as flying to where you're at right now, definitely not.
Yeah. So do commercial pilots have to do the exact same thing? Do they have to worry about the warning or no?
Yeah, they do. The only thing that, if you remember from the last session, to fly in Class A airspace, which is any airspace 18,000 feet up to flight level 600, you have to be on an instrument flight plan. And you have to be IFR certified. So by default, when you're on an instrument flight plan, you'll be getting clearances from air traffic control.
Okay.
Yep. All right. And then the final airspace, which actually is probably all these airspaces are important, and some of them have pretty bad consequences. But the one that is really the most, I'll say, useful to learn about is what's called the MOA, which stands for Military Operation Area. And they are all over the country. You can see them in every state. And here's just an example west of, where are we at here? Yeah, northwest of Austin. You can see a series of MOAs here on the screen. Brownwood, Military Operations Area. Typically, you'll find these, in sparsely populated areas, and the reason is there's a lot of military training that goes on in this airspace. High-speed subsonic jet training, and not necessarily at high altitude either. So transitioning this airspace is completely legal. It's completely at the discretion of the pilot and command. However, it's extremely important that if you plan to transition one of these airspaces, you determine if they're active or not. And you can do that one of two ways that two popular ways to do it. Either the times are published, online. You can look them up. And they're also published on the sectional itself. Now, you won't be able to see it on this website because, bless you, because the legend, the title page of the sectional is not here. But if you get a paper sectional, all of the MOAs in that sectional will have their published times on the inner title flap. And then the other way that you can get information about whether the MOA is operating or not is from air traffic control, and that's usually the most popular way. If you plan to, say, you're flying, east to west through these series of MOAs, you would call up probably Gray Air Force Base Gray Approach, and request Gray Approach November 1, 2, 3, 4. Request whether the Brownwood MOAs are operating or not, and they'll tell you. They'll tell you whether they're hot or cold. If they're hot, they're open. If they're cold, they're shut down. So I've never hesitated to fly through these. It's not really a big deal, but you do want to talk to air traffic control. They'll give you a squawk number so they can see you on radar, and they'll ensure that you stay clear of any of the high-speed jet traffic or military training operations. There's another significant amount of MOAs up near Wichita Falls. Once you guys start flying around Texas, you'll encounter these up here, the Westover military operations areas. And just finally, final note on airspace that is utmost importance, especially when it comes to prepping for the written test. And typically, this information shows up during when we talk about weather, because there's a whole bunch of stuff to cover on weather when it comes to aviation. But I figured since we're talking airspace already, we might as well just introduce the fact that each airspace has a weather minimum for visual flight rules. And the two categories, or the two things we're concerned about, are visibility and cloud cover. You guys hear me talk about, and maybe on some of the videos you also hear them talk about IFR flight versus VFR flight. Well, these are the weather criteria that determine whether a certain airspace is IFR, meaning you need to be an instrument rated pilot on an instrument flight plan, or if that airspace is VFR and you can actually fly in that airspace as a VFR pilot without an instrument flight plan. So just a couple themes here. You can see that the airport airspaces, class B, C, and D, that have control towers, all have somewhat similar requirements. You've got 3 miles visibility minimum. And then you've got similar cloud clearance requirements for C and D. And then class B is you just have to be out, you have to be clear of the clouds. You can be right next to the cloud, but you can't be inside of it. And these qualifiers here, 2,000 feet, 500 feet, 1,000 feet, are simply exactly what they say. Your airplane has to be at least 1,000 feet above, or 500 feet below, or 2,000 feet horizontal from a cloud in order to maintain VFR, legal VFR flight. And then class G, if we just stick into airport airspaces, class G has a whole bunch of different requirements depending on whether it's day or night, or whether that airport is at a MSL altitude below or above 10,000 feet. So I know, and I don't expect you guys to sit here and memorize this. This is definitely something you'll reference. But I know when I talk to you guys a couple months from now and you're getting ready to take a flight test or something, you're going to say, oh man, I'm still trying to memorize that damn table. So at some point, if you guys subscribe to one of the electronic flight bags, like ForeFlight, a real, I'll say, useful way to study these requirements is just by popping up the app, looking at the app, and seeing whether an airport is IFR or VFR. In fact, let's just do that right now. Hop over here. And ForeFlight has the ability to, it'll take the local weather conditions at an airport, and we'll give you instant feedback of what they call the flight category. Are we VFR or are we IFR? And green is VFR, red is IFR. And so it looks like Houston right now is generally VFR. If I pop open one of these airports, David Wayne Hooks Memorial, Yep, we got a visibility of 10 miles and clouds above 1,000 feet. So let's see. I think David Wayne is a class Delta. Yep, class D, because we've got a blue circle with a blue hatch circle. If I go back to my chart.
So if the weather conditions were not for VFR pilots, you would see a whole bunch of red circles on that.
Yeah, let's just go, we'll go take a look at one. I'm sure we can find one if we try. Yeah, like right over here. So where are we at? Florida, somewhere near Florida, Alabama. So these airports are experiencing some IFR conditions. So let's pop open this one. This appears to be Pensacola International appears to be a Class Charlie airspace because it's the magenta circles. And it is
San Antonio, right?
What's that?
That was the same as San Antonio, right?
Yep, San Antonio, you got it. So we've got 10 miles visibility. So we're good from a visibility perspective, but we are not from a cloud cover perspective. You can see they're reporting broken at 900 feet. So if I go back over to my table, class Delta is going to tell me that I need at least 1,000 feet above. So we're about 100 feet short. We need at least 1,000 feet of cloud clearance, ceiling clearance, in order for that field to be VFR. And just a couple other things here. The pink is low IFR. So not only is it IFR, but it's extremely what they call low, or the clouds are extremely low, or the visibility is extremely terrible. In this case, broken 400. So the clouds are 400 feet above the ground, very extremely low, to the point where you may not be able to execute an instrument landing. And then the blue, at least in ForeFlight anyway, is what they call marginal VFR. So it's like it's just marginally VFR. It's any minute could go IFR type weather. So you can see 1,000 feet. So it's right there. It's right at the minimum for VFR.
You mentioned in one of the emails this week that the ForeFlight was kind of a capital commitment. How much does it cost for the subscription?
It is $99 a year for the VFR package, and then it's $199 for the IFR. So you guys, for your private training, if you decide to invest in this tool, you would go for the VFR, the $99 per year.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. I think a lot of pilots would attest that it's completely worth it, because for the sole purpose that to purchase paper charts, it's, you guys saw the prices. I mean, I think you can go to the local airport and get them for like $10 or $11 a chart, but they expire every couple months. So to stay legal, depending on where you fly, you're going to be, you'll easily spend $100 on charts throughout the year.
And this has all the charts constantly updated.
Oh yeah. ForeFlight, for $99, you get the entire United States worth of charts, subscription for a full year. So you don't have to, every 2 months when it expires, you don't have to re-up. It's just once a year.
Is it only the United States, or is it the world?
The world is extra, and I think the world is like an extra $50 or something.
Cool.
Yeah, something like that. Don't quote me on that. So it's just an extra charge. All right, so that's weather minimum. We're gonna reference this table actually quite a bit, guys, moving forward, especially when we start talking about the weather. We talk weather theory and flight planning for weather. So so don't forget this chart, and we'll have a chance to look at it again. All right. Any questions on airspace? Either the ones we covered last class or the ones we just covered?
I'm good.
Good. All right. Let's jump into some navigation. Now, we're going to go over three kinds of navigation, three navigational tools. And we're going to hit them kind of in an awkward order. I'm going to talk about what's called a VOR receiver first. We're also going to touch on what's called an ADF receiver, and then we'll talk GPS. VOR and ADF, which I'll get to in a minute, are antiquated technology. They're kind of on their way out. However, the FAA expects its pilots to understand what they are, how to use them. And so you'll see it on the written test. You'll definitely be asked to demonstrate proficiency on the flight test. GPS, however, is kind of like the normal, the new normal, right? Very infrequently will you be getting in an airplane that doesn't have a GPS, but there's a very good chance you might be flying an airplane that doesn't have a GPS. So you want to know how to use some of the old technology too. So we'll start with VOR. VOR stands for a VHF, or it's like an acronym inside an acronym. VHF is very high frequency, omnidirectional range. And very simply, it's a radio tower that sends out a radio signal that you can pick up from your airplane using a radio receiver, using a VHF radio receiver. And the signals that are sent out from said tower have what are called bearing indicators, or, I mean, they use the word omnidirectional, but that's kind of it's like a term no one understands. It's the radio signals that are sent out from this tower have assigned bearings that align with the compass rose. So each radio tower that VOR is assigned to will have 360 discrete omnidirectional bearings that you and your airplane can track to navigate from point to point across the sectional. One more acronym to know, DME, distance measuring equipment. Each of these VOR stations, these radio stations, some of them have what's called DME, meaning not only are they sending out discrete radio signals for each degree of the compass rose, but they're also sending out a signal that will tell the radio receiver in the cockpit the distance from the station. So if you've got a VOR with DME capability, or you're tuned into a VOR with DME capability, you'll be able to tell which radial you're on, meaning which of the 360 bearings, as well as the distance you are from the station in nautical miles. Now, before I talk about exactly how they work in the cockpit, I'm just going to point out real quick what they look like on the map. Back to ForeFlight here. The VOR stations are denoted by blue circular compass roses on the map. So, for instance, we've got one here, Navasota. And we've got several of them all over the place. This one is Leona. So this would be called the Leona VOR. And so with this information here, you can punch this into your radio navigation device in the cockpit, your VOR receiver. The frequency is 110.8. And we're going to talk about how they work. Let me minimize some stuff here so I designed some of these slides so I could move some stuff around on the slide. So we're going to put our imaginary airplane right down here on call it a dead 300 heading for the Cedar Creek VOR. And it's 300 because I've got it indicated up here. The heading the heading that I'll be flying is 300. And I've tuned in 108.00, into my receiver up here, 108.00. And what the VOR gauge is going to do in the cockpit is it's going to tell me where my airplane's position relative to the bearing that I have selected. So here's my VOR gauge right here, bottom right-hand screen. You can see it looks very similar to the heading gauge. You've got what's called a CDI, which is this thing I've got colored red. That's what's called a course deviation indicator. We've got on the gauge what's called a to from indicator, and I'll talk a little bit how that works in just a second. And we've got what's called an omni bearing selector, OBS, which is right down here on the bottom left of the gauge. And this dial turns, and when you turn the OBS dial, the compass rose turns clockwise and counterclockwise so that you can select the radial. And so my airplane, like I said before, I am interested in flying on this 300 radial from the VOR station. So I've got 300 selected up here on my gauge, which I selected with my OBS course selector. And if I am on that radial, meaning my airplane is right on the 300 line, then the gauge is going to indicate as such. The CDI is going to be dead nuts in the middle of the gauge. If my airplane drifts over to the right, if I still have 300 selected, my CDI is going to drift to the left, telling the pilot that the course that I've selected, 300, is to my left. And same thing to the right. If I'm way over here, then the CDI will move to the right until such time as I correct my position back on what we call on course, and the CDI needle centers back at the center of the gauge. If I decide that I want to fly a different radial, like let's say I want to make a left-hand turn and fly on the 240 radial, then I would have to turn my OBS selector until the 24 was at the top of the gauge, and then I would have to center the needle. So the needle would deviate as soon as I turn the course selector. The needle would deviate because it's now looking for a different bearing, and then I would have to get to that on course radial until the needle centered again, and then I would know that I'm on that radial. Does that make sense to you guys, the general functionality?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now, where things get just a tad bit confusing, and this is where the FAA tries to really confuse the heck out of everybody on the test, is the to from indicator. Oops. Okay. Yeah, the to from indicator. So the VOR has a to from indicator to tell the pilot whether they are flying to the radial, oops, or flying away from it, like from it. I'm going to put my 300 back in there because that's the example we're working with. And so in the current configuration, where my VOR station is right here, my airplane's here, and the 300 radial is right here. Oh, by the way, just before we get too far, can you guys tell me what this radial is? Right here, just off the nose of the airplane before the station.
What do you mean? What is it? Like, what's the number?
Yeah. This radio right here.
Are you going from the plane to the station or from the station to the plane?
From the station to the plane.
It would be 300 minus 180, 120.
Yeah, 120. And oh, by the way, when we're talking VORs,
12.
yeah, 120. Well, when we're talking VORs, you always talk about the radio that you're flying on. So in other words, this airplane, because it hasn't reached the station yet, is flying on the 120 radio.
Okay.
Okay. I am now back to the discussion about to from. When you've got the 300 dialed into the OBS, the course selector, and I'm flying on the 120 radio, whoops, I will have a to flag. See this little V? That's called the to flag. I'll have the to flag if I am flying towards that radio, meaning this airplane is not on the radio, it's flying towards the radio. If the from flag was on here, like if that V was down here on the from, it would be flying from the 300 radio.
That makes sense.
Makes sense? So that makes sense, but here's the thing to keep in mind, and I didn't mention this, so I don't expect you guys to know this. The gauge has no clue what your heading is. It has no idea what the configuration of your airplane is. So the airplane doesn't necessarily have to be pointed in this direction and flying in this direction. It could be, and that's where the confusion starts. Your airplane could be pointed in this direction, but if the from flag is up, then it's still on the opposite side of the VOR receiver as whatever course you've got selected. Does that make sense? Maybe?
Say that again.
So
I understand that doesn't matter which way you're pointing it. Does the from get set based upon the course selected and the side of the radial you're on?
yes, that's exactly the point I was trying to make.
So
Thanks for clarifying that. That's exactly right.
The 300 set, the 30, but you were flying the opposite direction that the plane is pointed in now on, I'm going to say the south side just because of the shape of the slide, the bottom side of the VOR. Even though you're flying away from it, it would still say you're flying
to
300.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, we could be flying in this direction, and if your course selector is on 300, you'll still have a to flag. So the VOR gauge does not care what heading you're flying; it just cares where your airplane is in relationship to the actual station.
So the 2 is always the side of the radial you get. No, I guess that's not right. Okay, no, I get it. Got it. Okay, cool.
I don't. It looks like you're flying from it.
And that's why I want to touch on this. No, that's why I want to touch on it, because the gauge, it says to or from, but it's not intuitive. So let me see if I can. Well, I can't. I wish I had an interactive VOR gauge here. But essentially, let me draw the opposite situation that we have on the gauge. Right now, the airplane is on the 120 radial, which we already went through that math. This is the 120 radial because it's reciprocal of the 300 radial right here. So with our current course selected of 300, the VOR gauge in this airplane is telling the pilot that the 300 radial is 2. You are flying to it. If I were to turn the course selector so that the 120 was the selected course. In other words, 30 is not there anymore. It's now 12. Then this flag would flip and go to the from side. And what that's telling the pilot is you now have the 120 radial selected, and you're going to get a from indication. You're flying from the station. But my point earlier was the gauge does not know what your heading is. It doesn't. It doesn't have any reference to what direction your airplane is going. So it doesn't matter whether you truly are flying away from the station or not. I mean, for example, your airplane could be flying this way, and you would still have, if the 120 was your selected course, you still would have a from indication on the VOR receiver. Still confused?
I'll digest it.
Yeah, probably.
Can I offer another explanation that helped me think about it?
Yeah, go.
So you set the course selector.
You do. Yep.
Right. So it's always going to report to you based upon what you've set. So if you said I'm going to 300 and you're on the 12 radial, which means you're below, right, based upon this picture, you're where the plane is now, then it's going to say you're heading to 300.
That's right.
But if you still had it set to 30, but we're flying towards 120, 120 side, it's going to say you're coming from it because you did it wrong. So it's only going to ever tell you based upon how you set it, whether you're to or from. Does that make sense? That's how it helped me understand it.
Yeah, exactly. The only influence that you can have on this gauge is through the course selector, regardless of what heading you fly.
So it's how you set it.
It's how you set it, correct. It does not, this gauge does not turn with the airplane. It stays on the 300. In this example, it stays on 300 until someone physically turns this dial right here.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'll try one other way. So let's say that the dial was set, the course selected was 12. So forget that 30 and make it a 12 on the square diagram. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah.
Okay, so what it's saying is you've told me that I should be heading toward the 12, which means if I'm on the 12 radial, then that should be my 2. Right?
Other way around.
Sorry, it should be my from.
Yeah,
okay?
from.
But if I'm not on the if I'm actually headed the complete opposite direction, then it's going to think incorrectly. So if I'm telling it I'm heading towards the 12, but I'm really heading towards a 30, the 2 and from are going to swap because it's wrong. Like you set it wrong based upon where you're actually headed. It's probably not helpful to. I'll stop there. I'm probably making it worse.
Well, I mean,
you're not actually. So, but it's really just the matter of I set, and if in this scenario, if the airplane is going south versus north, then I'm going from it. I'm going from the course that I actually set. Is that correct?
Not until you're on that radial.
Right. So the thing to keep in mind is the airplane or the gauge, the VOR gauge doesn't really care which direction you're flying. It just cares where the airplane is relative to the station.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this goes back to the omnidirectional thing that Adam was talking about at the beginning. That dotted line going from that center point down to the plane, when you're on that line, on that side of the radial, the thing that's being broadcasted is 120. If you go to the left or the right in terms of an arc, that number is going to change. So while you're on that perpendicular line on that side of the VOR, your radio is going to receive the number 120. If you're above it, you're going to get the number 300. So that's how it knows what radio you're on. Now, if you tell it that your heading is 300, but you're on the 120 radio, then it's going to say you're heading to 300, regardless of what direction the plane is on, because you're on the 120 radio, but you've told it that you're heading toward the 300. So it's saying you're headed to 300 and from 120, because that's the side of the VOR that you're on. That's all I can tell you is I'm getting the 120 signal. You've told me that you're going to 300. You're on the 120 side, therefore you must be going to 300 from 120, regardless of which direction the plane is pointed. So if you get it wrong, if you're saying I'm headed towards 120, but you're on the 120 side, it's going to say you're coming from 120, regardless of what direction the plane is pointed.
Yep.
That's helpful.
Yep, that's actually a really good way to explain it. Yep, that's exactly right.
Sweet. This has been a lot of overwhelming information, so I get excited anytime I actually get something.
Yeah, right. So yeah, no, that actually is a really good way to explain it. The radio, if the radio thinks it's on the radial that you've selected, it's going to automatically think you're flying from it. And if you've selected the opposite radial of the one you're on, the radio is going to think you're flying to it. So yeah, that's actually a really good way to explain it, Alan. And so, you know, what you can do if you get really good at using VORs is you can actually find a point in space. You can determine your location in space by using two VORs tuned into their frequencies and centering the course deviation indicator. Now, if you remember in this example, I told you that if the airplane is on or aligned with the radial that you've selected, in this case the 300, that your course deviation indicator will be in the center. And it'll deviate based on where your airplane is relative to center. Well, if you tune two different stations in, like VOR-A and VOR-B, to the respective frequencies and center the course deviation indicators, then you will be able to determine where you are on the sectional. So let's just do a quick visual example. So I'm going to pick let's pick a couple that are close to each other. Okay.
Do you typically have more than one VOR instrument in the plane?
Yeah, typically if an airplane's outfitted with VORs, you've got two. Yep. So we've got one VOR here, and this is the Waco VOR, Alpha Charlie Tango. And then we've got a second VOR up over here, which is Cedar Creek. Okay, and so just for kicks, let's say our airplane is right here over the town of Wortham, and we think we're over the town, but we want to make sure. So we're going to dial in our VOR radios. I'm going to put 115.3 into the number one VOR, and I'm going to put 114.8 in the number two VOR. And then I'm going to tune the OBS dial, the course dial, until the CDIs align right in the middle. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to note what the course selected is. So in this case, if these were my VOR dials and my airplane was exactly here where it's at, then I would tune in a course of 24 or 240 on this one, and a course of 360 or 0 on this one. And if I do so, the needles are going to center. Why? Because I'm on those respective radials.
This is like triangulation.
That's right. Yeah, you're just you're triangulating your position using two radio receivers, radio signals. That's exactly right. And so just to kind of, and I don't want to do this to confuse either of you guys, but just to solidify the last point about to from, the airplane is flying from, or the way Alan explained it, I really like. It is on the radial that's selected, right? So that means you're going to get a from indication on this VOR.
I thought it would. Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry. It's a little slow, but I get it. Yep.
Yep. Now, just to go a step further, if you wanted to see a to indication, you would have to flip the dial until the 180 was on top.
Yep.
Okay. Because then in that case, you're not on the 360 radial anymore.
You're still on the 360 radial.
Okay, yeah, you're on it, but you're flying to the opposite radial.
Right.
Yeah.
It thinks you're trying to go to 180 while you're on the 360.
That's right. Meanwhile, on this receiver, you've got 240 selected, which means you're also going to get a from indication because you're on that radial. Gosh, Alan, I really like the way you explained that. That actually made me understand it better, I think.
Sweet.
So you're on the 240 radial, which means you're going to receive a from indication. If you want to see a to indication, you'd have to rotate your OBS dial until the 060 radial was on top.
So you may be getting to this, and so feel free to table me, but so you've triangulated, but are you having to then sort of hand draw those intersection lines on the map as best you can while you're flying? This is assuming you don't have a GPS or a iPad or something like with a digital flight bag.
Well, honestly, the only way you're going to utilize this legitimately in flight is just with your eyeballs.
Yeah. So I mean, you could quickly maybe draw a dotted line with a pen if you had like a knee board or something and go da 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 da. Okay, that looks like I'm roughly near Witham, based upon the outcomes of the radials or the VORs.
Yeah, exactly. You'll dial in. I mean, you'll be like, oh, okay, let's dial in the. You can't even see it, but maybe like the 070 radial over here, and it'll center, and then you could be anywhere from here all the way along this radial, right? Until you dial in this VOR and realize you're on the 210 radial. And then you can say, okay, well, I'm somewhere on this line here, but then the 210 radial says I'm like kind of right in this neighborhood.
So this is really good for like a quick ballpark guesstimation of I'm roughly within a specific area versus pinpoint accuracy, because I mean you're gonna be moving anyway. So
yeah, it's definitely not pinpoint accuracy, and really, I mean, I don't mean to be like arrogant when I say this, but it's the really only reason to learn this is for emergency purposes, because typically you're gonna have a GPS, and if your GPS goes out, you're gonna want to know how to use the old school method, really.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay. So I thought just maybe to make sure that I'm explaining it well enough and you guys are understanding everything. I was going to just do a couple examples here, and I pulled these questions from the FAA test. So these will be kind of the questions that you see on the written test. So the VOR is tuned to the Dallas-Fort Worth Vortac. The Omni Bearing Selector, OBS, is set to 253. So I've got that set up here. You can see 253 is generally straight ahead. And you've got a 2 indication. So there's my flag, the 2 flag. And a right course deviation indicator deflection. So my CDI, CDI is right of center over here. What is the aircraft's position relative to the Vortac?
So the aircraft is going to be on, it's going to be on the 7.3 radial to the left of the 7.3 radial.
So you're saying it's going to be like somewhere down here?
Is that? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that'd be right. Why? Because we've got a right course deviation, meaning that the radio is, the VOR gauge is essentially telling us we need to fly to the right. We need to chase the needle. They call it chasing the needle. And so to get to the course, that means the pilot's going to have to turn his airplane, fly it over here. Once he gets to, I think you said the 073 radial, is that right?
If my mental math is correct, then yes.
Yep. The 073 radial, which is the reciprocal of the 253 radial, which I've got drawn here. I've got the 253 radial drawn. The 073 is on the opposite side of the compass rose. So as soon as the airplane gets to that radial, the course needle is going to center with a 2 indication. And so the pilot will turn and fly on course.
Can we go back to the first? Actually, I don't. No, you don't have to go back. Let me just ask the question. On the first slide with the VOR, there were little dots, and there's a little note that says each dot is 2 degrees. So if it's, let's say, 3 dots to the right, does that mean you're 6 degrees off the 7.3 radial? If it's with that same question?
Yes. I think you're exactly right with that. Yeah, 2 dots per 6 degrees. 1 dot per 3.
1 dot per 3. So each dot represents.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. You know what? I'm gonna take a note because there's a rule called the 60-to-1 rule, and 60 nautical miles. See if I can recite the rule here. 60 nautical miles from the station, 1 dot is 1 mile. And so you'd have to turn that into degrees. But I think you're right. I think it is 3 degrees per dot. Okay. But I'm gonna go check that.
Cool.
Question mark, yeah. Yeah, and that's actually a good question because you can tell, depending on how far you are from the station, you can tell if you look at how many dots. Let me get back to a real VOR receiver here. Yeah, you can tell how many dots the CDI needle is deflected. So in this case, the 2 dots. If you know how far you are from the station through DME up here, then you can tell how far from the course you are. You can tell whether your airplane's like that far or like that far in nautical miles. And that's the 60-to-1 rule, which I don't have off the top of my head. I'm going to have to look that up for you guys.
So along that lines, in terms of performance of flying, I think my first indication wouldn't be necessarily to immediately try and do back to the example we had below, a hard right turn to get back onto the right radial, but instead look for another VOR and see if I could in better direction there and do, the shortest distance between 2 points to straight line, not a right turn, left turn. So,
yeah. Well, and you know what typically will happen is if you're like way out here and you're like way off course, You'll ask air traffic control, or well, it doesn't have to be air traffic control. If you're just flying by yourself, VFR without being on a flight plan. Yeah, you could simply just go direct to the VOR by turning your course, your OBS, and centering the needle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because if I turn my OBS, let's say my airplane's down here, and this, you know, I'm glad you brought this up because it shows the versatility of the gauge. If your airplane's way off course down here and you've got a right deviation on your CDI, I'm going to turn my OBS selector to get a radial where the needle centers. And so basically, I'm probably going to be, you know, if my airplane's down here, let's just, I mean, this is a good exercise. Let's draw another line. So my airplane's down here, which means I'm like on the 29, well, no, I'm flying on the 100 radial.
Mm-hmm.
100.
Yeah.
And so if I select 290, which is the reciprocal up here, oh shit, up here, then that needle will center. And it centers because I'm actually flying on that, I'm flying on those radials.
And if you have a DME, then you'll know when you're starting to get pretty damn close to the VOR center. And then if you needed to get back onto the 256 radial, you could then adjust the OBS again.
Oh yeah, like if you had to get onto the 256, you would fly up this way, and to your point, once you're like a mile away, you would just start your turn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I think I get how to use that tool.
Yeah. So I mean, the two things that you'll be expected to do in your flight training is fly a course. So, you know, the example that we just went over, right, where your airplane's down here and you've got a course, then you need to go find it. And then the second example that you'll have to show that you know how to do is fly direct, what they call fly direct. And that's the example that you just brought up, Alan. You center the needle based on wherever you're at, and then you fly direct.
Cool.
Yep. And the reason they have you do that is because typically when you get into a tight spot, you know, if you call air traffic control up and say, hey, you know what, you know, my last known position was this, I'm lost. They're going to say, okay, well, tune into this frequency on your VOR and center the needle, and that'll get you found again. So that's a lost procedure.
Cool.
All right, let's do it. Let's do another one here. All right, refer to figure 28, which is the VOR receiver. The VOR receiver has the indication shown. So you can see we are 2, and the OBS selector is on 210. So what radial is the aircraft crossing?
I think I know the answer, but I'd like to give Chris a shot if she wants to try.
Chris, you want to give it a shot?
No.
You'd be on the 030 radial.
Yeah, this one's kind of a trick question, but it tests the knowledge about the to from again. So let's configure the airplane. So the VOR receiver says we are flying to the 210 radial. So that means that we are not on the 210 radial. We're flying to it. So that means the airplane's got to be like right here. Okay. There's my 210 radial right there. So just for point of exercise, according to the VOR, we would be flying from the 030 radial because that's the radial we are on. And the question is asking what radial is the aircraft crossing? So I'm gonna reconfigure our airplane just to make the question a little bit easier to understand. So if I'm flying the airplane like that, I'm technically crossing the 030 radial if my VOR looks like this. And the reason that is because, remember, the gauge doesn't really know what your heading is. It could be this that we had earlier, but it also could be just crossing like this. You could also be flying away from it like this. The gauge would still look like this. So I think once you guys can understand that the gauge is not really understanding the direction your airplane is going, it only really understands its position relative to the radio signal.
And what you told it you should be doing.
Right. So the easiest way for questions like this, and you know, I kind of have to think about it in a two-step process. I've got to set my airplane up like it would typically be set up, you know, if I had the gauge, you know, configured this way. So if my gauge, if I have my OBS selecting the 210 radial and I've got a 2 flag, that means I'm flying to the 210. I'm not on it, I'm flying to it. So that means my airplane's got to be over here where it's at. And now it's just a matter of understanding kind of the trickery inside the question. What radial is the aircraft crossing? Well, you know, technically it's crossing 030, but it could be in any configuration. Is it, hey Chris, is it starting to make a little more sense?
Yeah, the crossing bit of it does, yes.
Yes, yeah.
The way they reported.
Mm-hmm. Now, just to reemphasize, to get a from flag, to reverse the flag from to to from, I would have to turn my OBS selector until the 030 radial was up at the top, because that's where my aircraft currently is. VOR receiver thinks I'm flying from the station on the 030 radial. All right. Kind of another twist on VORs. There's an instrument in some airplanes, some higher performance airplanes, called a horizontal situation indicator. And I mentioned before the VOR receiver and gauge right here doesn't really know, or doesn't really care what heading you're on. The HSI, horizontal situation indicator, it does happen to know what heading you're on, because what this gauge does, what this instrument does, is it combines a VOR with a heading indicator. This this compass rose actually turns as the aircraft turns, just like your heading indicator does on your gyro instrument. And so typically, 9 times out of 10 in your training aircraft that you guys will fly, you're going to have a VOR gauge. You're going to have a VOR gauge, and then down on the instrument cluster, you're going to have your separate heading gauge. And so you're going to have to cross-reference back and forth between the two. You're going to have to watch your heading gauge because you want to know what direction your airplane's going in. And then you're going to watch your VOR gauge because you're going to want to make sure you're on course. Okay? But the HSI allows you to do that in one gauge, because you've got your heading gauge here, it turns, and your VOR gauge is right in the middle with your course deviation indicator and your OBS course selector down here to the left.
That seems like a very helpful gauge.
Oh yeah, it's way better than having what they call a fixed card VOR, where it doesn't know your heading. It's whatever you tell it the course is. And this instrument does not work off of the gyroscopes or the vacuum system like your heading gauge does, your heading indicator. This is an electronic gauge, and it has an electronic compass in it. And so it's not susceptible to vacuum pump failures or anything like that. As long as your electrical system's working, this is working. But it works off the same principles. It's got a course deviation indicator. It's got a to from flag. In this particular example, the to from flag is just an arrow. And so you can fly and use it just like a regular VOR gauge. It just is simple right there with the heading indicator. And then there's a third gauge that is known as an RMI, radio magnetic indicator. And this is where our ADF comes in. Now, one thing I forgot to mention when we started talking VORs is VORs are actually, they are a dying technology. The FAA has a list of 500 plus VOR stations that are due to be decommissioned over the next 6 years or so. So, for example, we've got one VOR station over here, Glen Rose, which is just southwest of where I live. It's going to be decommissioned in late 2018, so you'll no longer be able to use it. And so my point is VORs are a dying navigational aid. Probably 15, 20 years from now, we won't even have VOR receivers in the cockpit. ADF, which stands for Automatic Direction Finder, is even more antiquated than a VOR, and they are almost extinct. There might be a few of these left out there, but what this simply is, and I'm going to kind of breeze through this because I don't even think you're required to know this anymore as a private pilot, but they still exist, so you should know about them. It's a beacon. It's a radio beacon that, unlike a VOR, is non-directional. It doesn't have omni-bearing or omnidirectional signals. So unlike the VOR, with your ADF, you cannot pick a course line. You can't. The instrument will not tell you where you are relative to a course line. Instead, it's just going to point in the direction of the station. So here's my ADF right here, this green arrow. And if I'm flying my airplane, what that green arrow is telling me is that the station is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 55 degrees to my right. And so what do? I turn my airplane, I turn my airplane 55 degrees to the right, and I fly towards the station. And that's all you can do with an ADF. And let's find some ADFs. Go back down towards you guys. I'll bet you I can find one. Let's see. Ah, there we are. Sandjack. So ADF is the instrument in the cockpit. The navigational aid is called a non-directional beacon, or an NDB. And they are little purple, fuzzy, circular things. like I'm pointing out right there with the mouse. Is that easy for you guys to see, the purple, fuzzy, circular, spherical?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. So that's a non-directional beacon. And you tune your automatic direction finder to 347, which is the frequency. And that gauge, that green arrow, will point in the direction of the station, and you turn your aircraft in that direction. It's that simple.
So these indicators are dependent upon the actual place that you're landing?
Yeah, so these instruments read the radio signals from these particular stations. So this is just one example of that. I could probably find another one just for. Sometimes they're located at airports. Sometimes they're not. Let's see. You can see the non-directional beacons are really non-existent. By gosh, I can't find another one.
There's one north of Houston near the Huntsville airport.
What's the
how do you tell the airport code on the map? UTX?
It's in parentheses.
KUTS?
UTX?
S as in Sam?
You mean Sierra?
Yeah, Sierra. I'll get used to that.
Yeah, okay, so here's another one. It's on the airport grounds. And it's got a frequency of 308. But to your question, Chris, they don't have to be on the airport grounds. If I could find another one that wasn't on airport grounds, I would. But you know, your VORs, a lot of your VORs are not on airport grounds. Like there's a VOR right there, the Leona VOR. It's not on an airport. Yeah, so NDBs are just non-existent. But you never know. The airplane that you fly may have one. You want to know how to use it for emergency purposes if your GPS fails and your VOR fails. Okay, and then we get to GPS, which is pretty much what everybody uses these days. And most airplanes that you guys will fly are going to have a GPS in the panel. If it doesn't, chances are you're going to bring an iPad with you with a GPS program on it. So there's really not much of an excuse these days not to have the technology. But, you know, in the case that you do need to use it, it'd become very useful to know how to use VOR navigation, be able to, in an emergency, navigate by way of VOR. I have had I've had one incident where the panel mounted GPS did go out, and so it wasn't too big of a deal because it was VFR. But you know, if it was IFR, I would have had to transition over to VOR navigation. So, you know, it used to be the future, and now it's like it's an everyday thing having a GPS in your cockpit. Global positioning systems utilize what's called receiver autonomous integrity monitoring to ensure that the signal that you're getting is within a certain specification. A lot of aviation GPSs will be plus or minus 5 feet or plus or minus 10 feet, which is extremely accurate when it comes to GPS. And you will want to know what the you know, some of the parameters are on your GPS, the specific GPS that you're flying with, which can be found in your operating handbook. For instance, this Garmin 750 that's on the screen, it's got what's called RNAV1 capability, which means it's so precise that you can use it for instrument landings. It's accurate to like half a foot. So you know, you want to be able to recite the RAIM acronym, Receiver Autonomous Integrity Monitoring, which is the way the GPS tells, you know, how accurate it currently is. And you'll want to also know as you're flying, especially, and this is probably more useful for instrument flying, but you're also going to want to know how many satellites that your GPS is utilizing at any one time. Because the more satellites it utilizes, the higher the integrity, the higher the accuracy. And so minimum 4. And I think most, you know, I've seen when I've checked the satellite integrity on GPS in our airplane, I think it's pinging like 6 or 7 satellites at any one time. So, you know, as you're using these, just know that there are limitations, and they don't always have 100% accuracy depending on where you're flying, but they are pretty good. From a safety perspective, you know, it's tough not to have one in the cockpit. All right. Your ForeFlight, if you guys do decide to go with an electronic flight bag like ForeFlight, you know, this has moving map capability similar to a GPS. So you bring it with you on your flights, and you can utilize moving map technology, assuming you've got, you know, a GPS either in your iPad or some third-party GPS hooked up to it. And navigating by GPS, there's really not much. There's really not much to talk about because it's just extremely easy, right? You don't have to choose radials. You don't have to choose to or from. You don't have to choose a course line. You simply just pick points in space and draw your flight plan and follow the line essentially.
Do you put all your waypoints into the GPS system?
You do, yeah. Just like in that example in the screen, that pilot's got all his waypoints loaded that he's going to fly, and you can kind of see it on the screen, the white lines.
Yeah.
And if you're using ForeFlight, I mean, it looks like this. You'll be flying along, and your little miniature airplane will be somewhere on this course line, and you'll just be making your way up to the next waypoint. But every now and again, it is fun to kind of utilize the old technology and make sure that you still know how to use it, and, you know, realize that it can get you places just as well as the newer technology. Okay, so what I thought we'd do, we've got about a half hour. I thought we would just do a flight plan. We just plan a flight from start to finish, just to kind of keep the concepts going that we've been learning, if that's okay with you guys.
Yes.
Okay. I want to recite the equation that we should always keep in mind when doing our flight planning. You know, we're going to get our true course from the sectional. So we're going to start with that. We're going to apply our wind correction angle. And people, I think I mentioned this last time, people switch these all the time. It just depends what your style is. You know, either apply your wind correction angle first and get a true heading, or apply your magnetic variation first and get a magnetic course. Either way, once you know your wind, once you've factored in your wind, you've got a heading. And then once you've factored in your variation, you've got your magnetic variation, you've got a magnetic heading. And then, of course, we can't forget about deviation. So we're gonna plan a flight. Oh, and also, don't forget about your cruising altitude rules. I went over this last time, right? The cruising altitudes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yep, don't forget plus 500. It's odd on the eastern side of the compass and even on the western side. All right. I have pre-chosen this flight for us today. Since we'd been doing so much research on those flying clubs down in Pearland. By the way, is it Pearland or Pearland? How do people pronounce it down there?
Pearland.
Pearland? Okay. So I've planned a fictitious flight from Pearland to Austin Executive via the industry VOR. So there's our flight. As we mentioned last time, essential part of our flight planning is checking out our chart supplement book. And these are available in print. You can get them online. And we're just going to kind of read through this to check out to see if there's anything crazy we need to know about. You know, we've got our, we know what time zone it's in. Don't really care what the coordinates are. This is interesting here. TPA. Any you guys want to venture a guess at what TPA stands for? This is kind of a tough one.
Some sort of an estimate or addendum?
It's traffic pattern altitude.
Oh, geez. Okay, yeah, never got
Yep.
that.
So it's telling us to see remarks, so we'll see the remarks. All right, got trees, runway 14, okay, so we're good there. Not really care about fuel because we got full tanks. We're flying in the daytime, so I don't really care about lights. All right, airport remarks, okay, it's attended during these times. Traffic pattern altitude, 644 feet, which happens to be 600 feet above the ground. So 644 mean sea level altitude. Oh, that's for helicopters, I'm sorry. 1,044 for single and light twins, and 1,544 for large twins and jets. Okay, so that's important to know. There's my traffic pattern altitude. I'm a light single. All right, not a helicopter, not a helicopter. Okay, we've got a lighted oil derrick, 116 feet AGL, half a mile southeast of the airport, so somewhere down here. Okay, so this all looks good. All right. I've got my frequencies here in case I want to contact air traffic control when I take off. But we don't have to because this happens to be a Class Gulf airport. It's a Magenta airport, Class G. So we do not need a takeoff clearance. There's no air traffic control at the airport. Okay, everything looks good here. Is there anything you guys see that's that you want more explanation on, or that looks interesting you want to discuss?
Was there a key?
Yeah, there's like a 7-page legend.
Okay.
Yep.
That's special.
Yep, there's a huge legend. But you kind of get used to some of the acronyms. Some of where some of the important items are. Like for instance, traffic pattern altitude is extremely important because it's different at every airport.
How did you know what LGT had to do with lights?
Well,
I mean, that's a stupid question. Why does LGT mean lights? What's the acronym?
Well, it's short for lights. It's missing the I and the H.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was trying to make it like lighted ground transit or something like that.
Yeah, right. Oh yeah, these publications are notorious for just like shortening words, All right, and then we got Austin Executive. Let's see if there's anything cool here that we want to be aware of. Same time zone. Nothing too interesting. Displaced threshold. So okay, this is important. Runway 13 has a 600-foot displaced threshold. I'm going to show you guys what that looks like.
I actually know what that means. That's the part before the runway.
Yeah.
And depending upon the signage is whether or not you can actually take off on it, or you just avoid it altogether, but you can never land on it.
Yeah, man. It sounds like you've been studying, man.
Like crazy. I'm just I'm so intimidated by all this. I'm just trying to learn. Yep. There's okay.
Yep. Yeah. So there's the runway 13 displaced threshold. And just like you said, you cannot land on it, but you can take off on it.
And that's indicated by the 4 arrows at the fat white line.
Yep.
That indicates that the displaced threshold can be used for takeoffs. And if it couldn't, they would be stacked, right? Like big chevrons that go the full length of the displaced.
Yeah, they would look like, let's see, who's got those? Maybe DFW does. Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, those chevrons.
Yeah, so you cannot use those for takeoff or landing, right?
Right.
Okay. All right, so this is important, right? I want to know this before I get there because I want to just be mentally prepared that I'm not going to land on the front part of the runway. I got to make my way to the actual touchdown zone. All right, nothing too crazy here.
Wait, is that indicated by the odd shapes closer to the 13 on this runway?
I was wondering the same thing, like the little ovals.
Yeah.
Oh,
Is that what that is?
yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly right. Yep.
Okay.
Chris, I was wondering that same thing.
Exactly right. Yep, you bet.
So you can't land there. You have to clear those ovals. And you
got
land.
that. Yep, that's right. You have to fly to the far side of the ovals and land in what's called the touchdown zone. See, DFW may not be a good example, huh? They may not have. They've got blast pads on all of them. Yeah. So you have to. The touchdown zone is between the threshold, which is the white bars here, and the touchdown marker, which is this big fat, these two fat bars. So you have to land your airplane in between those two. But you are allowed to taxi and take off on that displaced threshold.
And you're always landing in the direction that the arrows are pointing?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You're either, you're traveling, whether you're taxiing, taking off, or landing in that direction. You just cannot land until you pass over this thick line.
You could be landing from the other side of the runway though if the winds have changed.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So either you're landing on runway 13 or you're taking off on 13, or you could be landing on 31 or taking off from 31, depending upon the wind.
Right. Yeah. If you guys remember, you take off and land into the wind to decrease your ground speed and increase your true airspeed.
Cool.
All right. There's probably nothing too interesting here. Couple important notes about air traffic control that we might want to know about if we decide to call air traffic control. You know, which frequencies to use. But we're not going to be talking to air traffic control, so. All right. So let's plot our course. If you guys remember from the last session, we are going to get our true course by measuring the acute angle between a line of latitude, such as this one down here, and the course line. So I've got my course line drawn, and I am taking an acute angle, and when I measure that with my protractor or my plotter, I get a heading of 291 true. And if we remember from last session, or actually a couple sessions now, to get our magnetic course, we've got our true course of 291. Our magnetic course, we're going to have to adjust for variation. So I'm going to look for one of those magnetic variation lines, the purple or the magenta dashed lines. And I've got one right here in the middle of the screen.
3 degrees east, which is subtraction, right?
That's right. Subtract east. So 291 minus 3 is 288. Now you have to be careful because if you're going from magnetic course to true course, it's the opposite. If it's east, you've got to add.
Yep.
But we're going true to magnetic, so we're going to subtract. 291, so that means we got 288 magnetic. And, oh yeah, by the way, I do have a waypoint here. I've got the industry VOR. So I'm going to have to account for two different bearings on my flight. And that second bearing, I'm going to take, yet again, another acute angle from latitude to the course line, and I get a 297 true course. And I think we're at 4 degrees at this point, aren't we? Yeah, 4 east.
Yeah. Okay.
So 293 magnetic. Now, just a caveat, because this comes up quite a bit. If we're going to fly with our VOR instrument, I don't really need to know what my true or magnetic courses are, right? Because I'm gonna fly with the VOR.
Well,
I'm gonna tune into the industry VOR, and I'm just gonna center that needle and fly straight towards it.
well, conservative flying would say have a backup in case either the VOR omnidirectional beacon is out or your equipment fails.
There you go. That's exactly right. One point that's important, though, and this will just drive you nuts. This is the FAA for you. You ready for this? So when these VORs are commissioned back, 50 years ago, they were calibrated to the magnetic North Pole at the time. And I forget if I mentioned this or not. You guys can tell me. The magnetic variation on Earth's of Earth's magnetic field, it changes all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe is that something you guys know because of the industry you're in, like the declination changes?
Yeah. So that's for me, yes, because they actually publish charts, and so when you're talking about magnetic declination, you often have to know the date of the measurement to know exactly what that means.
Yeah. Yep. So when the VORs are commissioned, they are calibrated to magnetic north when they're commissioned. Now, this magenta line here, this magnetic variation line, is pointed towards magnetic north. And you can tell that they are not coincident any longer. So about 20 or 30 years ago, the FAA stopped calibrating the VORs. So if you're going to navigate by VOR, you're going to have a different course than what you measure on the chart.
Interesting.
So I kind of eyeballed this one. It looks like if we're flying by VORs, we're going to be on the 283 radial for the first leg. And then once we get to the industry VOR, we'll be on the 290 radial after that, which you can see is about 3 degrees off from the magnetic course that we drew using the line of latitude. So just something to keep in mind. It's why we go through these examples. I want you guys to see some of the, nuances that you just don't think about when you're doing your flight planning. And then I took the example and I drew it out on the screen here. We're going to be flying our airplane 283 to the station, and then 290 from the station. Okay. And before we go to the next slide, I want to go over here to my log, because I've got a VFR flight log going. And I've got a couple different waypoints here. I picked some airports. Let's see. I picked Sugarland Regional Airport as my first waypoint. So there's Sugarland Regional. And then I picked Interstate 10 as my next waypoint. And then I picked maybe, what did I pick next? Okay, I picked a radial off of a VOR. I picked the 360 radial off of ELA. So that's the Eagle Lake VOR. 360 radial, straight up. So can one of you guys tell me how would I go about finding that point in space when I get there using the VOR?
You would set your OBS to 180 or 0, 360, up to you. And as long as you could do the switch for the to the from in your head. And then when you said straight up, so I'm looking at the actual 0-degree line. That's where I would know I was. Is that kind of what you're asking, or are you talking more true north?
Well, I'm gonna be on my course line here, this blue line.
Yeah, but so when you say straight up, that actually might be a little bit more or less. So I would take the 0-degree line, set my directional indicator to that, my OBS to that, and then whenever the line matched up, I would know that I was there.
Spot on. That's exactly right. That's exactly what you would do. You would set the VOR to 116.4 with a 0 in the course selector. And for 1,000 points, can you tell me if it's going to show to or from?
If you set it to 0, it would say from.
Yeah, exactly. And you would wait for your course deviation indicator to swing, is what they call it. So it's going to, in this case, swing right to left. And as soon as it crosses, you are right on that radial.
That is so freaking cool.
Yep. So you can see I've picked a bunch of other waypoints to get to our airport. They're about 15, 20 nautical miles apart. And then, we'll make up some numbers here. Let's say my wind is out of the south at 25 knots. And we'll just say it's constant the whole way there. Okay. And I've got my magnetic variance 333,444, because remember it changes to 4 once we get closer to Austin, and it's all east. And so this particular tool, which I just got off a website somewhere, automatically does my my magnetic course. So it's automatically doing the variation calculation. And then I've got a little compass card over here to kind of pretend. And I'm going to populate, or I already have. I'm going to pop. Yep, there's my deviation. It happens to be about 4 degrees on this side of the compass. So
because we're at 280.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm 4th. Okay. Oh, I lost visual. All right. Yeah, could you? So if you're going for 300, you would steer 308. Are you interpolating back to 280?
Yeah. So essentially, it looks like the compass is more or less accurate when you're going west. 270.
Yeah. Okay.
But when I swing to 300, I got 8 degrees off. So 280 is, somewhere in between 270 and 300. So I just used a 4 value.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
How do you get the deviation again?
So the deviation is actually given to you. It's part of the compass's inaccuracy due to different electrical fields in the aircraft from the instruments and stuff.
Oh, you're right. That's applicable to each aircraft that we're flying.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the compass card is actually located right beneath the compass itself, so you can see it the whole flight. All right, we'll finish this out here. I haven't taken my distances yet, but what we'll do is when we go over here, and what you'll do when you have a paper copy of the chart, is you will determine, what your distance is from airport, from Pearland to Sugar Land. And let's just say I measure that, and Say that's 10 miles. We'll just, for the sake of example, I'm just going to say I picked waypoints that are 10 miles apart each way, even though I know that's not. You have to measure each individual one.
Do you use nautical miles or static miles?
Say that again.
So I got that part, but they have nautical miles and static miles. When you
Nautical
use,
miles.
oh, okay. Wow.
You're breaking up a little bit. Did you ask another question?
I said no, right.
Okay. Okay, and I'm going to give ourselves. We're going to have a fast airplane today, so we'll have a true airspeed of 168. All right. So you can see that this particular spreadsheet, did my wind planning for me. It's already giving me a ground speed of 170 plus. So we're moving, because it looks like I fabricated a wind right out of the south, and we're more or less traveling, in the configuration where we would have a tailwind, quartering tailwind. So in this particular case, even though I know my distances were fabricated, it looks like it's going to take me 23 minutes. And let's say my airplane burns 18 gallons per hour. And it looks like I'm going to have plenty of fuel when I land. So you remember, part of your flight planning is always ensuring that you've got fuel reserves. You don't have, you're not going to run out of gas on your way to the airport. So by the math that this spreadsheet's doing, it looks like we're going to start with 38 gallons and we're going to finish with about 31.
You said that this was a fast speed. What's a typical speed for knots?
So the training aircraft that you guys will use probably are around 110, 115. And it's going to be about maybe 9 gallons an hour. And 38 gallons is probably accurate for fuel.
So it's like basically 35 minutes to get from Houston to Austin.
I made up my distances, so let's use some real distances here. So it looks like it's going to be closer to probably 150 nautical miles, 140 nautical miles. So I've got to essentially find a way to double all these distances. So take about an hour and 8 minutes. Is that beat driving? I've never driven from Houston to Austin.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a third of the time.
Hey, there we go.
Yeah.
That's why we become pilots.
Yeah, exactly. Is that a rule of thumb? Like it would be that from when you're driving?
Oh, it's amazing. It's a half, at least a third. I mean, once you guys start flying more complex aircraft, it's real fast. I mean, the clubs that I sent you guys in that email have airplanes that will travel at 168 knots true airspeed. So you'd be getting to Austin in 47 minutes.
That's awesome.
Oh yeah, you get there in no time. It takes me, for me to drive and see Allen, it's like a 5-hour drive. But when we get in the airplane, it's like an hour and a half, maybe.
Nice.
So, okay, so we've got our flight log filled out. We're check on the fuel. We're good there. We've got our time. We've got our waypoints. We know that we're going to have a tailwind, so that's good. And really, the only other things that we really want to consider that I'm going to kind of add to this flight planning session that we didn't talk about before was a couple of additional services that you can use as a private pilot, air traffic control, and flight service. Air traffic control, we actually have an entire session dedicated to, but you know, you are encouraged as a pilot to utilize air traffic control at all times, regardless of what kind of flying you're doing. As a VFR pilot, they offer a service called flight following. And as a VFR pilot, you can request flight following once you're airborne. So this would be after you departed from Pearland Airport. You would contact air traffic control. Houston Approach is who you would contact, and request VFR flight following. They would give you a discrete transponder code. If you guys remember when we talked about airspace and equipment requirements, the transponder was one of those requirements. So to utilize VFR flight following, you have to have a transponder. They will give you a code that you put into the transponder, thereby allowing them to see you on radar. And air traffic control will give you flight following services, traffic advisories, weather information, really anything that you ask of them, they will probably be able to give you. Now, they are required to give you traffic advisories. They are not required to give you weather information. However, they typically do if you ask. And then flight. What's that? Was there a question? No? And then flight service is a completely separate product, I'll say, completely separate service. And they are primarily used for weather planning and weather updates, like in-flight weather updates. Unlike air traffic control, they do not provide traffic separation. They do not have radar. They can't tell you if there's delays going into certain airports. They are purely there for a airport information and weather purpose. And 99 times out of 100, you will utilize FSS or Flight Service Station for weather. You can call them on the ground. They have phone numbers. You can use their website. They just actually, a couple years ago, they really improved their website. So I use their website all the time. It's excellent. And you can call them from the airplane through the published frequency over wherever you're at.
This is the flight following.
This is flight service. I'm sorry. I switched over and started talking about flight service.
Okay.
Flight following is air traffic control.
Got it.
Yep. Flight service is weather and filing flight plans and airport information. So, in other words, if if I didn't, let's say I heard that Austin Executive had a displaced threshold of 600 feet, but I wasn't sure, and I wasn't sure where to find it, even though this is kind of a dumb example because it's pretty easy to find. But I could call Flight Service, FSS, and ask them, hey, how long is the displaced threshold at Austin Executive? And they would tell me, oh, it's 600 feet. So they have that kind of information. And when you look on your sectional, you can get flight service frequencies. So let's say you're departing from Pearland and you want to contact flight service because you want to get a weather report. You just have to look around the map and find the flight service frequency. Let's see. And you guys are like, oh my gosh, so you're doing this while you're flying an airplane? Well, this is an example why trying to find a flight service frequency on a sectional is a terrible idea. The better option is to go to your chart supplement and find it there. Oops. So there it is. So weather data sources. And there's the phone number. So if you're on the ground, you would call that phone number. So we're going to spend a whole session talking about air traffic control. We're also going to touch more on flight service when we talk about filing flight plans. So it's just good to know kind of the difference between the two. For this particular flight, if we were making this flight, I would probably do flight following. As soon as we departed from Pearland, I would probably call Houston approach and request flight following. And they would give me traffic advisories, updates to weather if they have time, and stuff like that. It's a really good way to stay in touch, and it's good for search and rescue too, in case you have aircraft problems and have to make an emergency landing. The frequency for Houston approach is in the chart supplement too. Right there, Houston approach departure control. 134.45.
So you set your radio to that.
Mm-hmm. Set your radio to that. As soon as you're off the ground and ready to comply with instructions, you just tune that into your radio, and Houston approach, November 1234, just departed Pearland to the south, 3,000 feet, en route Austin Executive via Industry VOR, request flight following, and then they'll give you a squawk code that you'll put into your transponder, and you're good to go.
And this is not mandatory, but it's just best practices.
That's exactly right. It is not mandatory at all. It's a good practice because then you get on their radar screen, and they can help separate you and keep you out of trouble from other aircraft, especially when you're flying around a major terminal area like Houston, right? I mean, the minute you get up to 4,000 or 5,000 feet, you're gonna be flying around jets and airline traffic and all sorts of stuff. All right. So that's the material I had. I've also got a video that I will send you guys the link to. Did you guys end up watching the video from last time, the pilot who got lost above the clouds?
Yeah.
That was pretty nuts, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a good lesson of, it's better to do something safe than not talk because you're afraid you're going to get in trouble.
Well, yeah, and what do you guys think? I mean, you can Monday morning quarterback the thing, but do you think he had one of these?
Hold on, I lost you. Okay.
Yeah, do you think he had one of these flight planning logs?
Not to the level of detail that you do.
Yeah, I mean, he
knew
from my guess is he was using his fuel gauges to determine how much fuel he had. He wasn't using to the third significant digit type methodology, right?
Mm-mm.
So that video is a good example of how things happen very quickly, especially when weather's involved. I know we haven't talked about weather yet, but we will. One thing goes wrong, like the weather goes bad. Second thing goes wrong, like your alternate, you can't get to your alternate, and then the third thing goes wrong, your fuel's low. I mean, it's just nuts. So having something handy like this, where you know exactly how much fuel you have at each particular waypoint. Oh, by the way, you're checking your watch the whole time to make sure that you're hitting your waypoints at the right time. It's good piloting, and will keep you out of trouble when things get challenging, because you could get to an airport and the weather could be bad, right? And it may be unexpected. So at least you know kind of how much time you have left, and it'll help you judge where you should fly to try to find a place to land, that kind of stuff. So that's why these logs are so important. It really teaches you to over-plan your flight.
So you got 8 different waypoints on this flight just from Houston to Austin. What's the longest flight you've done and how many waypoints are there? Because is it typical to have kind of approximately 10 per hour or?
So what I usually recommend is when you start your flying and when you start planning cross countries, you want to space them about 10, 15 nautical miles, 20 maybe at the most, just until you get used to it. Because what you're going to find is you're going to take off and you're going to fly to your first waypoint, Sugar Land Regional, and everything's going to be great, right? You're going to get there in 6 minutes and 50 seconds. You're going to fly right over the airport. And then you're going to get to your Interstate 10 waypoint, and you're going to be like a mile left of course. And it took you 2 minutes longer to get there. And so you have to make adjustments to your inaccuracies, because this is just a plan, right? It's not perfect. You're going to totally have different, you're not going to get there at exactly 6:50. It might be 7:30 or 9 minutes. And so the closer your waypoints are, the less dramatic your course errors will be.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you plan a flight and your waypoints are 50 miles apart, you could really get into trouble, because if you're way off course, you may be like 5, 6, 7 miles off course and be lost. So so that's why you want to plan them closer. But no, when you start getting real good and you're doing cross countries all the time and you got your license, you might stretch them 40, 50 miles apart and feel comfortable. It's all about comfort at that point.
Thanks.
Is there a way to use ForeFlight? So let me ask this question. I want to practice this, but I have no idea if I'm right. Is there a tool that would do this kind of waypoint calculation for me that I could check my manual work against?
Yeah, let me show you guys real quick. I'm pulling up my ForeFlight right now. Okay. So let's pull this up on the iPad, and I'll do my best to share with the webcam. But here is the. Hold on a second. Let me. Okay, here's the same thing on the iPad. Can you guys see that okay?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Now, if I hit the flight plan button up here, my flight plan is going to come down, and you can see, let me just look at this real quick. It gives you your magnetic heading, your distance, how much fuel you're using, and your time right across the top there. See, it says, see the M in the heading column?
Yeah, magnetic.
Yeah, that's magnetic. Yeah, it'd be magnetic heading, right? Mm-hmm.
Can you add waypoints like you did on this Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah. I can, like, let's say I want to pick Sugar Land as a waypoint here. Oops, hold on. Yep, it's got a real nice drag and drop. You just grab the line. And let me see if I can do it live here without totally being crazy. So let's say I want to pick another waypoint in between the two. I just hold the line, and it's going to ask me what I want to pick. And I want to pick Houston South Airport. And it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I think it did it wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. Here, hold on.
But I get what you're saying. So I'm planning to subscribe to this. I just wanted a way to practice manually and have something that was smarter than me tell me if I was right or not.
Right. Now, the one thing you do have to be careful with, because I know what your intentions are. You want to do it on paper and then do it on the iPad. you just have to make sure the iPad. So ForeFlight doesn't know what your deviation is, right? And I don't believe there's a way to put deviation in there. I'm pretty sure that's not part of it.
Yeah, but I can figure that out.
Yeah,
I just want to give
exactly.
the ballparks. Something that gives me the ballpark for things like directions, timing, fuel usage, things of that nature.
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
on the Google Drive folder, right? In it, rather.
What's that? Say that again.
The spreadsheet tool is in the Google Drive folder.
You know what? I'm gonna put it there. If it's not,
Okay.
Yep.
I haven't looked, so I don't know.
I likewise. It probably isn't, but I will put it there. Do you guys like this format, by the way? I just kind of found it.
It's as good a start as any. I may tweak it because I'm an Excel freak, but yeah. Chris knows.
So I'm chuckling over here.
Cool.
Yeah. So I'll let me ping you guys the. I won't keep you because I know it's late / early depending on where you're at. Chris, I can't believe you're still awake. That's Chris, you're probably jet lagged.
I am.
So there's the video. This particular video is nuts. I want you guys to pay attention to the fact that, again, I'm pretty sure the pilot didn't have a log, so he probably wasn't aware of fuel, time, waypoints. Second, he didn't do a weight and balance, which they talk about in the video. And take note. You guys remember when we talked weight and balance? If you've got a heavy aircraft and if it's over maximum weight, that affects all your performance parameters. You're going to burn more fuel. You're going to be slower. You can't climb as well, etc. So that definitely plays into this video too. So it's another one in the series of cross-country flight planning mistakes. So any other questions on the material or any of the navigation stuff, VORs, NDBs, any of the stuff?
No, I think that made sense tonight.
I'm sure I'll have questions later.
Oh, okay, fair enough. All right, guys, I'll post this and then I'll get some questions out and let me know what questions you have as you go through it.
Thanks.
Will do.
All right, see you guys.
Bye.
Later.